Pixar was created off of spite and pure delusion, and that is what made it so magical in the beginning. And it all started with this guy, Alexander Schur, who in 1974 had a dream. He wanted to make a fully computer animated film. And to do this, he invested a ton of money for 1974, $15 million. Working out of a garage, he formed what was called the Computer Graphics Lab, and joining him was Edwin Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith. They had a small team running and quickly realized that this was not a sustainable practice, the way that they were throwing money into this and not really making any. And that's where Francis Ford Coppola and George Lucas come into play. Alvy Ray Smith went and met with them, and they quickly pitched what their team was doing. George Lucas loved the idea and immediately offered Smith a job on the spot. But they had a contract with Schur, and they realized that they couldn't all just leave at the same time, because he also offered 5 other members of their team a job. And so what they did was they went ahead and all left one at a time over the course of a year, taking on temporary jobs during that year before officially joining Lucasfilms. And with that team, they created what was called the graphics group of Lucasfilm. Pretty much all of the ones I mentioned before, Edwin Catmull and Alvy Ray Smith, both left the computer graphics lab as well as most of the team, and so the majority of the team for Lucasfilms was comprised of the original computer graphics lab. This was in 1979, and they also realized they wanted a new name for their little group, not to just be the graphics group, and so they called themselves the small division within the graphics group, Pixar. Where the actual name came from is highly debated. Some people think it came from picture art, but we'll never know for sure. And they were doing great things at the Lucasfilms group. They, in 1982, worked to make what was called the Genesis effect that was used in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and that started to put them on the map. And in 1983, another thing that's kind of important happened, and that was the hiring of this guy, John Lasseter. He was hired to work on a short film called The Adventures of Andre and Wally B. And he's going to come up in this story a lot more later. So it's 1983, they're making great strides towards their goal, but something horrible happens to this group, and that is George Lucas gets a divorce. And this is coinciding with the end of the Star Wars films coming out, so they're losing that revenue from them as well. And not only that, George Lucas is losing a ton of money to his ex-wife. This puts the team in a panic, and they quickly realize that he's either probably going to sell them off or lay them off, and so they decide to go ahead and form their own unique company. But this is easier said than done, and they went to 35 different investors trying to pitch this own group, and they were unsuccessful. Enter Steve Jobs. The year is 1985, Steve Jobs has just been fired from Apple, and he's looking for a little payback. And so he decides to spend $5 million to buy Pixar from George Lucas, and then another $5 million to invest in them in capital to try to make an updated computer system that will be able to compete with Apple. But even with Steve Jobs, this group is not very profitable. They decide to sell computers in the meantime, as well as having John Lasseter and his team make little animated shorts for commercials, but they're bleeding money. It gets so bad that Steve Jobs had to invest even more capital and go from being a board member to just the full outright owner of the group. But they got lucky. Disney was struggling with their animation group during this time period, going through the Disney Dark Ages, and they wanted something to help spark people's imagination once again. They really enjoyed seeing the Genesis effect in Star Trek II, and so they contacted Pixar and asked to use their new system called the CAP system. And so Disney signed a contract with Pixar to use the CAP system, which stands for Computer Animation Production System, and they went ahead and used it in their next film from 1990's The Rescuers Down Under. But most people are going to recognize the use of caps in the ballroom scene in Beauty and the Beast, as that is where it's most famously used. While all of this is going on, John Lasseter's over with his little team making a short film titled Luxo Jr. You may recognize this character as the logo for Pixar for a good reason. And once again, Disney is just kind of astounded with Pixar's work. They like the cap system, they like the unveilment of Luxo Jr., and they want to hire them to make a movie because now they believe in the ability to make a fully generated movie. But what makes this even funnier to me is that John Lasseter was previously fired from Disney because he believed and was too enthusiastic about the idea of a fully computer-generated film. So now he has come full circle where they're wanting to sign a 3-picture deal with Pixar to make 3 fully computer-animated films. But the computer systems were still a little bit behind, and so this took a lot of money, and once again, Pixar is bleeding money. Steve Jobs is still having to invest, and as late as 1994, he is thinking about selling Pixar off just because he wasn't convinced that Toy Story was going to be successful. But then the early critical reviews and reception came in, and everybody loved it and thought it was going to be a major hit, so he decided to hold off until 1995 and see how Toy Story did before selling the group. And it's a good thing he did because Toy Story was, in fact, a huge hit and made $448 million, which at the time was a lot of money for an animated film. Now remember how I said they had a 3-picture distribution deal with Disney, but they are not owned by Disney at this point. Because Pixar is so successful, they get a new campus, Steve Jobs takes on a more active role in being part of the group, and they continue to make more films, even coming up with multiple ideas. But Disney came to them, and the CEO at the time was Mike Eisner, and said, "We want a sequel to Toy Story, and we have the rights to do it, and we're going to make it with or without you, so choose." This sequel was meant to be a direct-to-DVD sequel, but Pixar agreed to work on it with the intention of it being direct-to-DVD. But then Michael Eisner saw it, and he said, "No, this is too good. I want to put it in theaters." But because they had agreed to make it for direct-to-DVD, it was not going to be counted towards their 3-picture deal. Pixar was very upset about this, but obviously they didn't really have much legal recourse, so they had to only continue doing that 3-picture deal and technically made it 4 movies. So they did Toy Story, Toy Story 2, Bugs Life, and Monsters, Inc. But Disney was not a good business partner. These deals were not equitable. It gave Disney all the rights to the characters, most of the money, and just wasn't a good deal for Pixar, so they started looking for other people to work with. They, of course, tried to deal with Disney and did multiple attempts coming to the table over, I believe, 10 months, where they had over 10 separate meetings where they all failed to come with a solution that they all agreed upon. And this all culminates with Disney saying, I don't need you, and making their own 3D animation studio called Circle 7 Animation, and if you've never heard of it, that's because they never made a single film. And then Pixar went around, they shopped Warner Brothers and other studios, but they weren't able to come to an agreement with any of them and came back to Disney. They were then able to make a temporary agreement for Finding Nemo as well as The Incredibles, but they kept going back to the table. And then finally, in 2006, an agreement was made. Pixar was officially bought by Disney, but they had also an agreement making sure that Pixar remained its own separate entity, that they were allowed to keep the Pixar Brain Trust is what it's called, which was headed by John Lasseter, and he was given complete creative control over all films that would be approved for both Disney Pixar and Disney Animation Studios. Not only that, he would report directly to Bob Iger, the new CEO at the time, and both would not be able to work with each other or bail each other out. For example, Ratatouille was in production at this point. If they needed to, they could not pull animators off of work from Bolt, and vice versa. Disney Animation Studio would also adapt a similar principle with having creatives do a Disney Creative Trust, and they would have it so that they didn't have much oversight at the executive level, and that they would be able to have full creative control, which is when they had their Disney Revival era where they made such great movies. And this worked phenomenally well until John Lasseter was fired due to misconduct, which I'm going to go into detail about all of that tomorrow's video. But all of this is what culminated in Pixar being created, and what made them so magical was because they had just a dream and they made it a reality. And frankly, it's worthy of a movie in of itself.